Good afternoon, guys. What I wanted to do today is to kind of make a brief little video to give you some ideas about what it is I'm going to be doing in the AP Macro class tomorrow. So today, which is today's Tuesday, we passed out the syllabus and talked a little bit about course procedures and did a little bit of an intro activity. But the real AP Macro material doesn't really begin until tomorrow, and so I was hoping that y'all might be interested in seeing exactly what it is that I'm going to do with the kids tomorrow. Might give you some ideas or point you in the right direction if you don't know exactly where to start the course. The way that I like to begin the course is in actually a different place than the textbook begins the course. I learned to teach macro with the Krugman and Wells college textbook, which is the one that was adapted into our current high school textbook. And so the place where that particular textbook begins basically spends the first real day of economics instruction setting up what are called the rules of economics. And this is going to repeat itself at the beginning of the supply and demand unit as well. We're going to set up the rules of interaction and the rules of markets. So I generally take a day to kind of lay out all of the rules of the game for the kids before we even start talking about the production possibilities frontier, or we start talking about anything else, so that they have a pretty good idea of exactly where things are going for the rest of the unit. So if you're interested, go ahead and watch this video. I'm going to talk very briefly about each of the rules and talk about what it is I tell the kids along with some additional information that I think might be helpful to you if this sounds like something that you might. So rule number one that I want to go over with the students has to do with rationality and rational choice theory. So rule number one is basically that people, when taken as a group, and that modifier is going to be really important later on, behave rationally. And so what that essentially means for the students is that people behave in a predictable manner, in a manner that essentially makes sense. And you're always going to have one or two kids in the class and be like, well, sir, what about example of person that doesn't make any sense or just behaves kind of crazy? And that's why the important part that we need to stress is that when we're taking people on the macro consensus, basically looking at people as a large group, the group behaves rationally, even if, yeah, sure, one or two individuals within the group might be doing something that doesn't make sense at any given time. I like to stress when we talk about rule number one that people behaving rationally makes their behavior predictable, which is really important to us in eco because at the end of the day, eco as a social science is essentially about figuring out what people are going to do before they do it, and possibly more importantly, getting them to do something different, especially if they're going to engage in a behavior that we don't want to see. And so the whole game of incentives that we're going to talk about later on in this lesson is reliant on people's behavior being essentially predictable so that we can predict what they're going to do and change that behavior before it happens if it's a behavior that we don't necessarily want to see. So people as a group are rational even if individuals don't. At this point, I like to stress that we in eco, we're talking only about groups. We're going to make broad generalizations about people and about groups of people that may not hold true for the individual, but hold true for the group as a whole. So rule number two that I like to go over in this lesson basically is introducing the kids to the concept of scarcity, which is something they're familiar with but probably don't know the name for just yet. The general idea is that productive resources in our world are scarce, meaning there's not enough of them to go around, even though economic wants are not scarce, they're unlimited. So we essentially have unlimited wants chasing limited ability to fulfill those wants in the form of resources. And so this leads us to a situation where basically we're going to have to make choices. And in economics, we call those choices trade-offs. So I have, X amount of dollars with which to fulfill my wants. I can't have everything that I want this month. I'm going to have to make a choice as to which of those wants I'm going to fulfill. I'm going to go out and buy a cheeseburger, and which of those wants I'm not going to fulfill, which I'm going to forego in order to buy a cheeseburger. I may not buy a Ferrari or Taco Cabana or whatever it is I happen to be giving up in order to accomplish that cheeseburger. So understanding the basic concept of scarcity as kind of an economic rule of existence is the reason economics exists as a discipline. If we didn't have scarcity, if everybody could always have everything that they wanted, then we'd never need to make choices, and therefore we would never need to understand the cost of things. But because we want to be able to maximize the amount of benefit we get from our scarce resources, we then need to lead into rule numbers 3 through 6, which are going to help us to understand costs. That way we can make an informed and good decision about which resources we're going to use to fulfill which economic wants and which of our economic wants we're willing to just kind of let go and forget about. So scarcity is going to be key here. If we live in a world of scarcity, we can't have everything that we want. Following the discussion of scarcity, I'd like to then introduce essentially the concept of opportunity cost, which basically builds on the idea that there aren't enough resources for us to satisfy all of our economic wants. So rule number 3, as I put it up there, is the cost of something is what you give up to get it. And this is the way that we're able to use math and to use graphs to calculate the actual cost of fulfilling an economic want so that we can make good decisions about which of those economic wants are worth fulfilling and which of those economic wants aren't. This is where you start to do a little bit of cost-benefit analysis. So if I'm thirsty and I'm in the desert, certainly water is going to have a really high benefit for me. Whereas if I live, somewhere where water is plentiful, it may not have as much of a benefit. So being able to balance what something's going to cost you to fulfill versus what benefit you're going to derive from that is going to be important to understanding opportunity cost. Usually in this terms, I tend to put this thing in terms the students understand. So they usually understand time because especially our AP students, they have a lot of different demands on their time, and they're probably not able to fulfill all of those demands, especially if they're in our extracurriculars. So they usually get this pretty easily when I put it into terms of hours of the day, right? Are you going to go to football practice, or are you going to do your stats homework, or are you going to do your eco homework? And obviously the right choice is to do your eco homework, but the kids, I think, understand this entire concept pretty clearly when you present it to them in that way. So once we've set up a good basis for understanding what opportunity cost is, I then transition into rule number 4, which is related to that. So the rule number 4 is how much, the question how much, is the decision at the margin. And this is the point in the lesson where we'll introduce the concept of marginal analysis, which will then lead us to understanding the law of diminishing marginal utility, which usually takes a little while for the kids to process. They generally don't know most of those words for diminishing marginal utility, so we're going to have to spend a little bit more time talking about what that means. So essentially, if we live in a world of scarcity, we have to make choices, and opportunity cost is basically how we quantify the choices that we need to make. Then then marginal analysis is the way that we answer the essential question, how much? So just because studying for economics for 1 hour is a worthwhile thing to do and the benefit outweighs the cost doesn't necessarily mean that studying economics for 23 hours a day isn't necessarily a good thing to do. So there's a certain point where the cost and the benefit ratio kind of get thrown off when deciding whether to do something or not, and it's marginal analysis that's going to help us to understand that basic concept. The reason why the cost and benefit analysis changes over time is because the more of something you have or the more of something you do, the less additional benefit comes from another unit of that particular activity. So be it another hour of studying or one more cheeseburger or your 41st hour working in the week. This is what's called the law of diminishing marginal utility, and it basically tells us the more of something you have and the more of something you do, the less the benefit is for each additional unit of production, no matter what it is you're producing. Once the kids understand the concept of diminishing marginal utility, and that usually takes a little while to make sure that they understand the vocab there, you can then piggyback off of that to introduce them to the concept of increasing opportunity cost, which is basically the evil twin to diminishing marginal utility. Not only does the more of something that you do, you get less benefit for doing additional units of it, but the more of something you produce actually raises the cost. So what this tells us over time is that the more you do something, the more cheeseburgers you eat, the more hours you study, the more ice cream you buy, the benefit goes down over time due to the law of diminishing marginal utility, and the cost goes up over time due to the law of increasing opportunity cost. So eventually you're going to get to a tipping point where the benefit no longer outweighs the cost of the action, and at that point you will stop. I usually use tacos or cheeseburgers. I ask him, how many tacos or cheeseburgers would you eat if you could have as many as you wanted? And usually there's a boy who's willing to push it to, I don't know, maybe 3 cheeseburgers, but everybody stops at a certain point. If you ask them why, if additional cheeseburgers are quote unquote free, they would stop eating cheeseburgers. They'll tell you, they'll get sick. This is essentially this concept at play, that over time, the more of something you do, the higher the cost is to do it, and the lower the benefit is. So at a certain point, you will stop doing it. At this point, I then transition to the last 2 of the big rules regarding basically the big rules of economics, and they're related to each other, but not necessarily related to number 4, the way that they kind of cascaded. Rule number 5 is tying back to rational choice theory, in that as we understand people's behavior, again, as a group, we understand that people will exploit opportunities to make themselves better off. That essentially, if you give somebody the option to benefit themselves in some way, they're always, pretty much always, going to take that opportunity. And this is important to us because not only does it prove that people are rational, but more importantly, it makes people's behavior predictable, right? At this point, I'll usually ask the kids, like, I'll pull out $1 or $2. I'll be like, who wants money? Every single one of them is going to raise their hand because they want money. And I'll be like, why? And they'll be like, usually, I want to buy lunch or I want to buy something. And you can transition that particular example into their desire to better themselves without putting in additional effort, right? If somebody just hands you money, you are better off and you haven't really sacrificed anything. And so this is a rational choice. All of us will take the money because it's rational for us to exploit opportunities to make ourselves better off. You can also relate this, if you want to give a more easily done example, to like sales at a store. And be like, why does everybody go shopping when something's 70% off that didn't buy it at regular price? The kids will usually tell you that, they want to spend less money, or they wanted it, but they didn't want to pay the price for it. And this is this exact same principle in action. Give people the opportunity to better themselves at a lower cost than the benefit that they receive, and they will take that opportunity every single time. This is key because this makes human behavior, generally speaking, predictable, and predicting and changing human behavior is what we're all about in this social science. I then like to wrap up this lesson kind of piggybacking off of rule number 5 with rule number 6, which is that people, because they exploit opportunities to make themselves better off, will respond to incentives. You're going to need to define incentives for the students. You'll tell them, it's basically a stimulus that you create to elicit a particular behavior from another person. So, for example, people, if left to their own devices and there was no consequence, people certainly wouldn't pay their taxes at the end of the year. But the government has come up with an incentive, in this case, jail time. We usually make a joke about Wesley Snipes right about now, where if you don't pay your taxes, then there's a consequence. So that incentive of you go to jail if you don't pay your taxes is enough for, 95% of the population to give the government the behavior they desire, in this case, paying their taxes. So you'll want to go into a discussion of positive and negative incentives at this point, talking about how you can get people to basically do things either by offering them the carrot or the stick. And you may also want to discuss how a lot of the time, these incentives aren't necessarily overt. You don't necessarily tell people, hey, if you do thing, I'll give you, X, Y, and Z reward. But you just build a system, be it an economic system or a taxation system, that encourages certain behaviors by giving them a benefit and discourages other behaviors. If you want to get really far in depth, you can then, and this is something I like to do, go into talking about things like the tax structure and how this tax structure incentivizes people to invest. It incentivizes entrepreneurs to take risk. It incentivizes people to donate money to charity because all of those things result in a tax break, whereas it disincentivizes many other behaviors through the use of things like tariffs or excise taxes. So the government disincentivizes smoking or drinking or gambling because when you engage in those activities, you have to pay an additional tax above and beyond the normal tax. Kids may not be familiar with that because they probably shouldn't be smoking or drinking at this point. But if you tell them, there's an additional tax on cigarettes above and beyond the normal sales tax, that's not too hard of a concept for them to grasp. So this is basically what I do for the kids on the very first day. We go over each of these rules, takes me maybe about 10 minutes, a little bit less than 10 minutes to go in. Some of them are a little longer than others. But I feel like rather than diving straight in and going into the production possibility frontier on effectively day 1 of the class, I kind of want to set economics up like a game. And so at the beginning of the game, we tell the kids what those rules are, which is then going to help them tie back a bunch of the stuff we're going to learn, especially when we go into Tom and Hank and the production possibilities frontier. We can tie back a lot of that information to these same basic rules. So why is it that you see, Tom or Hank exhibiting X, Y, and Z behavior? Well, because Tom and Hank are rational, or because resources are scarce, or because we have to have trade-offs and make choices and decisions about where we're going to spend our productive resources. So hopefully this is helpful. Let me know, give me some comments if you listen to this whole thing. I'd like to know if videos like this are something that y'all are interested in. I'd like to get a little bit of feedback and see if this is something that's worth continuing to do. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a really good lesson tomorrow.